right. So on Facebook, you went live a few weeks ago, and you talked about what Appalachian Roundtable is, what people can expect to hear on a typical episode, and really who we want to be involved in it.
Right.
And whether or not it's a West Virginia thing, or is it a regional Appalachian thing? Is it Christian only? Like, what is this?
Are you asking me right now? That question?
That's
The
exactly.
answer. Okay. So you just want me to recap that?
Sure.
So the idea was, or is, that Appalachians have a stereotype of being uneducated yucks, basically. Just a bunch of inbred freaks who don't know anything. And we know that that's not true. We know that Appalachians just historically are an industrious people, that for all intents and purposes, without an Appalachian people, you don't get America. When the colonies landed on the east, they had to come through and over and across the Appalachian Mountains. And so to survive this, I mean, it was you're pretty much scot-free the rest of the way west. And so we want to give Appalachians a platform to talk about things like theology, to talk about things like culture, to talk about things like politics, and to do so in a way that is specific to our region, because Appalachia just gets forgotten. Everyone's always concerned about things that are happening in the cities. Everybody's always concerned about how Ohio votes, what's going on in Detroit, what's going on in Chicago. I've never seen a political demographic breakdown that considers Appalachians. A lot of times people who are Appalachians get lumped in with the South, and we're not the South. We're a different region. There is some overlap. We have concerns and issues that I think overlap a lot of more northern states, a lot of the Midwestern states, a lot of the southern states. We're really our own region, our own people with our own concerns. And so we want to offer us a platform to, from that perspective, address things like theology, address things like, what do I do in the voting booth as a believer, as someone who takes the Bible seriously? How do I vote? Anybody, obviously Appalachian natives automatically, it's like, if you were to have like a point system for people who were to apply to contribute, you get bonus points just for being an Appalachian native. Or people who are loosely connected to anybody who has an interesting perspective specifically for this region. So I think some of the things that we've talked about is there are a lot of resources out there that address things very broadly, that address theology broadly. I can listen to James White, who lives on the other side of the country, and I can glean a lot, because he's not just addressing people in Arizona. He's not just addressing people out west. He's addressing just the church as a whole. And I think it's a good thing. I think it's a great thing that we have ministries like that. But because we have specific concerns and because we have specific issues and just a silent voice for this region, I want to give that platform. So anybody with any sort of connection to Appalachian, as far as I'm concerned, is free to...
They have a voice here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I want to offer. And the idea for Roundtable came from the idea of having discussions with... This is almost going to sound contradictory to everything that I've just said for the last 4 minutes, but having discussions with people from different perspectives, because there are a lot of hodgepodge theological persuasions in this region, right? Like if I tell you that I'm from New England, you're automatically going to assume, and maybe rightly so, that there's a lot of Catholic influence in that area, And Appalachia, which is a whole host of things. We're not as monolithic as people think that we are. And so we want to invite people to the table to talk about these things that matter, and to kind of rap about stuff that is important to us.
So we are really a melting pot on the East Coast, where people find themselves with northern influences like New York and New Jersey and things, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania especially is a big leeway down here. Detroit's another one that comes straight down here. And then also people from down south who find vestiges here in West Virginia. Before they moved south, they were in West Virginia. So there's a long line of influence that people in West Virginia have, whether they realize it or not.
Right.
It seems important. Also, we've talked about this as far as this is for Appalachians, but it's from Appalachia.
Right.
There's definitely a cultural, maybe stigma or issue because of history, even with the coal mines. Outsiders are not to be trusted historically because of certain things that have happened, or how you had these outside companies come in, or maybe like rich people outside, and they bought the area, the land, and then they used the people here to get the resources and peace out and leave it worse than they found it. And so just to have people from here that are the people that walk the streets and, and worship alongside or work alongside the people listening, I think it's really valuable, and it adds some credibility in the minds of the people from Appalachia, especially like the coal fields or more rural areas that aren't spoken for in any other form, or from other people we know that are doing things. I mean, that in my mind is one of the biggest things.
And I also think, piggybacking off of that there's a sense in which, because we're Appalachian natives, because we're from the area, and because we're not outsiders, there's no sense of snootiness. There's no sense of of elitism that, at least for me, anecdotally, is a turnoff for a lot of mainstream talkers. There's a big turnoff, and I've talked about this before with various platforms over the years. Like Russ Moore is a guy that comes to my mind who just comes across as just real snooty and real kind of snobby and kind of an elitist, and there's kind of a thinking of like, you're the uneducated hillbilly, and like I said, there's some overlap from the South, like you're the stupid Southerner, you're the one who doesn't have the college degree, you're the one who only knows blue collar work and how to mine coal. I've been to college, so let me tell you the right way to think. And so, because we're from this area, and because most of the people who so far have contributed to the blog are either from specifically West Virginia or have been in West Virginia for an extended period of time, that they can bring an outsider's perspective of just a thing that they notice, because we know that we have blind spots. But I want to guard against a sense of, let me come to you. So similar to when you send a missionary into another part of the world, one of the things that you want to guard against is, I'm from privileged, educated America. Let me tell you, heathens.
Let me fix you.
Yeah, let me fix you. Let me tell you how you should think, right? And there's a sense in which that's true when it comes to the issue of the gospel, right? When you're talking about things like sin, when you're talking about things like salvation, and salvation being from grace, there's a sense in which when you're coming into a pagan society, you have some things wrong, but there are some cultural things that you don't get to speak to because you've come from the outside, right? So if you're not from the area, as far as I'm concerned, if you're not from Appalachia, I don't care what you think about how I vote, right? I don't care what you think about the way that I view family. I don't care if you have a different perspective, if you think that I'm ignorant because I don't believe in 8 weeks of maternity leave, or whatever. Like, pick your thing, right? If you're just some snooty New Englander, which is funny to stereotype people from New England, but if you're just some snooty New Englander who looks down on people who live in the hills and the hollers, I could not care less about what you think about the way that I vote, or the way that I think about the world, the way that I think about the Bible, the way that I handle my faith. But if you're from Welch, or you're from Polka, or you're from Charleston, or you're from any parts of Kentucky or any of the Carolinas that are kind of in this region, and you maybe have a different way to look at things, well, I want to talk to you, because I know that you're not coming to me in a hostile way, but we probably have a lot more in common than we do that's different.
And you mentioned earlier that so far we've only had West Virginia contributors, but that's just been out of convenience,
right?
Not our goal,
right?
We're looking to see Appalachian as a whole, not West Virginia. It's
Right.
not the West Virginia Roundtable, it's the Appalachian Roundtable. And with Appalachia, for better or for worse, a lot of people see us as a stepping stone. We're rarely a destination, an end destination. But stepping stones have their place. They keep, your feet aren't getting wet. So we've tried to do this before with Appalachian Roundtable. What was it, 2 or 3 years ago? Maybe even further beyond that.
Way
4 years
way
ago,
more
yeah.
than that, yeah.
So we ran into some speed bumps, obviously. But why? What's different now? Why are we doing this now?
You want to take that one first, Caleb?
Well, one of the first things that comes to my mind is in the same vein of what you've already been saying is almost this is to neighbors is one way to say it from like a biblical perspective. Like this is to and from neighbors having discussion that we could actually worship alongside of. These are people we hope will go to church with and see true change, not just people like across the country and even for our own sake, you know, getting popular or something. I mean, this is a more focused and a more refined, I think, thought and goal than we would have had before because we see a need. I think of where I was in a church in Boone County in the coal fields, and I came across the doctrines of grace just very providentially to even hear of that teaching and start to study. And then I had to learn from people really from way across the country. You know, Ligonier Ministries in Florida, or to look to MacArthur in California, or some of these people. There was nothing local that I easily was connected to or with. And so in my mind, that makes me almost think of there was a female judge in Scripture, and that was really sort of a judgment from God to the nation
Punishment.
that the men were not serving as they should be. And I would like to, for us in some way to help facilitate or step up into a role which, if there are other people like I was, that we're there to help, you know, I guess be a resource or be alongside of, not to replace any church, but churches together, you know, Christians spurring on one another in good study and in difficult topics, but to go back to the source, you know.
Yeah. I think that's different for me is that we've matured a lot over the last 4 years.
Sure.
So similar to like what Caleb is saying, you know, we're not, I don't want to speak for you guys, but for me, like I wanted some internet clout, you know, like I wanted to be the Jeff Durbin of West Virginia, you know what I mean? Like that's what I wanted to do. And now it's this weird mix of, I want Roundtable to have exposure insofar as it's helpful to people. I want people who need a resource, who just need to hear from laymen to talk about things that are not new ideas, they're not novel. These things have been talked about amongst Christians for millennia, but need to hear their own voices, you know. And so I just think some personal maturity in all three of our lives that just come from life, that just come from marriage and from work and from all the things that life throws at you in a 4 or 5 year time period. I think now we have more with that maturity comes a more direct focus, in that I can think, instead of just broadly thinking, oh, I want to do a podcast with my friends. Now I can say, okay, I want to do a podcast with my friends that is tailored towards in this direction, has this goal, has this end in mind, and being more self-aware of what my strengths and what my weaknesses are to that end is light years from where I was 4 or 5 years ago, to answer about what's different now.
And when we first began, I don't think any of us realized the amount of time and effort that it would take to do something like this. None of us considered the cost before we started building. And hopefully, with those 4 years behind us as our guide, we've really learned that we really have to focus and we really have to put in time and effort for it to be meaningful, for it to actually have any lasting impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. It will certainly, I think, with the maturity, hopefully have more interesting things to say or a more dynamic perspective. But also, I think the topics and things we would want to cover will be more helpful. And I mean, practical is a word you could throw around a lot, but you have these two realms almost. You can think at the end of the sermon when the pastor takes what was written or said to certain people, at that biblical time, and they try to contextualize it to now. You have an abstract, which is like the doctrinal aspect of it. So how it speaks to other parts of theology, and how it might imply, or speak over those. But then how do we live daily, I think is a lot more a part of what we think and maybe where we'd seek to press these matters too. I don't think we didn't think about that before, but yeah, because of life experience, because of what we do at our jobs, like my job has definitely changed me a ton because of what I have to deal with there, and some of the circumstances or parts of life I have to deal with. And so I think that focus would be a lot different, and I think that's a lot more valuable too. When we look at our culture, we have a lot of issues within the church as far as probably issues doctrinally, even with the basics of the gospel. And I definitely say that from my time in like a youth kind of high school ministry, going from between different schools across the region, and seeing what the teachers that were for the facilitators, what they had to say and throw in, and that no one batted an eye at, how loose it was. Like there's definitely abstract theological issues, but then press it on past it. You could go to church and every week hear preaching on the gospel, or that's always the tie-in, but never hear anything about sanctification or means of grace, or we're called to holiness, but how is that achieved? How do you even interpret the Bible better, or grow in these things? Or even thinking of what from a classic, historical Reformed teaching, maybe what people would teach on the means of grace within the church and the role of communion, or the Lord's table. Like I never heard any teaching or something on that, and then how meaningful that is. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of practical aspects that are a lot bigger or more important in our minds now that I think would tailor the conversations and the topics and all of those things a good bit as well.
It's almost like culturally, Appalachia is anemic in that area, because it's daddy was a preacher and his daddy was a preacher and daddy's was a preacher, and just come from this long line of preachers, but no theologians, right? Like no great that I know that I can think of off the top of my head. There's no great theologians of the last couple centuries that come out of this region, which is partly a fault of the pastors over the generations for not taking the time to dig in and not taking the time to read more, but also partly because of I think a neglect of this region. I was talking to, I don't remember who it was I was talking to the other day. I was talking to somebody about neglecting this area in that, I was talking about the chasm that there is nationwide in terms of ideology and ways that we think and the way that we view things. If you look at the left and the right now, it's two completely different countries. And there are people back to when I was talking about this elitism who cannot fathom, who do not understand that right now in the year 2021, there are still people that do not have internet access at home, right? They cannot fathom the idea that there are people who do not have running water in America today, right now. And so there's been a real negligence of the region because for I don't know why, people don't have turned a blind eye to us. And part of that fallout has been there's no real desire to do the hard work of come pastor here, of come and do the pastoral work, because you're doing a lot of, in some cases, you're doing centuries work of, you're undoing centuries worth of bad work before you can even start building. You're essentially leveling houses before you can start laying new foundation, and you're starting from scratch, and you're essentially replanting in this area because there's just been that negligence,
It's been an epidemic too, because I remember growing up in various churches, and they would see me, and because I knew my Bible, because I knew my doctrine, I was kind of pulled out from the herd and said, "You're going to be a preacher. You're going to be a teacher," and not recognizes, no, he's not special in this way. This is just the normal way it should be. But because that bar is pushed so low, when you see someone who has any type of inkling, any type of knowledge of the Bible, they're seen as so different from the other kids, the other guys, that they have to be a preacher, they have to be the theologian. Mm-hmm. But that's a mentality that's been passed down, like you just said, Anthony, from pastor to pastor to pastor, where we want to separate ourselves from one another just because he knows more Bible than I do.
There can be, I think what's really unfortunate is that you see that is automatically labeled with arrogance, or something negative. It's almost like it's bad to pour too much study or get too technical with doctrine. Like, you don't really need to drill down into this. And then you look back at history. And even if you take it away from theological study within history, like historical theology, you just look at stories from church history and see the important role of confessions and catechisms and how the church has dealt with different doctrinal issues, to see how important it really is. Just to have, even if it's not just a confession, but to look back and see that there are these guardrails on the church that are put in place to keep people, within the fence line for their own good. Because what you believe ultimately definitely changes the trajectory of what you practice and how you go. And there's examples of that as well. And you can't expect to come to God to worship him rightly if you don't even know how he said to worship him. And, that's part of what we talk about with worship. Or if you want to grow in holiness, if you want to do all these good things, to put aside sin and to take up the different means God has given, you have to know what those means are. You can't just put that aside. That's something I think that's so huge within the culture from my experience in churches, in the past, or just going for a week. There's an altar call, and every week everybody feels so guilty and goes up because they've heard the same, potentially good call of the gospel, but without any back end to say, well, here's how we actually live in light of being redeemed, and these are the tools God gave.
They point at the finished product, but they don't tell you how to make the product, right?
Yeah, bridge the gap.
They don't give you the tools to build what they're saying you need to build. And that can cause a lot of issues, which we've seen here in West Virginia specifically, is things like depression, anxiety, and you turn to drugs. Mm-hmm. You can see people who say that they've come to faith, but they never have, and they turn away from the faith. So there's a real issue, and I'm sure it's not just West Virginia, but of course that's what we have to deal with on a daily basis with the churches we grew up in, with our friends and coworkers and everything. You talk to your coworkers like I do, and they talk about the faith that they hold, but they don't take it seriously. And if you do take it seriously, you're the one who's labeled as a zealot. Mm-hmm. You're the one who's, like you said, labeled as arrogant and not willing to concede any ground to secularism or any type of anti-Christian belief.
And think how important this is now, coming with, regardless, maybe you're, being too concerned, or conspiracy theorists, some may think, we're looking at the political climate or what may happen. But regardless, it certainly is getting more important to know where you stand and why you hold that stance as a Christian, within certain encroaching attacks or, positions on the church, whether it's, any number of issues now. It would have been like, gay marriage or something several years ago, but we've moved far past that. And then what if you're a Christian business owner, thinking through these things? You have to have the foundation of theology, of knowing what the Bible says on different issues, to then take that over into the practice. And that is probably one of the biggest things I hope that we really achieve, is maybe even just make people think about other topics or think about stuff in a different way, and see ways in which the Bible is applied in ways you wouldn't have thought. Because I think that's something early into being converted and being a Christian. It's not just that this verse says this specific thing. It teaches this one thing. But in light of that, we can jump 2 and 3 steps over and conclude certain principles from it.
Well, it doesn't really start in the church. Obviously, there's an issue there. But it starts with the individual. And for people who are fathers or husbands, that's the easiest way to integrate true biblical living through your family, and to set that as a standard that's passed down through generations. And of course, Anthony, I'm sure you can talk more about that.
Yeah, I think of, just as a dad, I think about what's the next 20 years going to look like. And I want like I want my boys to know kind of what Caleb is saying, like what they believe and why they believe it. And I want them to be able to defend it because despite my eschatological leanings, I'm not very optimistic for the next couple generations in America. And I want them to know what they believe, and I want them to know why they believe it, and I want them to be able to defend it. And that's not primarily, right now at least, my pastor's job. That's my job to catechize my kids and to teach my kids and to instruct them. And so, like for a 3-year-old, that looks like Daddy tells you to do something, you're expected to do it. And so I want to, but in order for me to do that, I have to be doing the work myself. I have to be thinking myself, and how does my faith apply to how I drive to work on a Wednesday afternoon? Like how does it apply to the way I respond to the guy that's cut me off, or how does my faith impact the way that I interact on social media? Right, like those are the little teeny tiny things that you can, if you can't connect those dots, how can you expect yourself to connect what you do, what you say you believe, to the voting booth? Or how can you expect yourself to connect what you say you believe to the way that you raise and discipline your children, right? Like if I can't think through, oh, I'm a Christian, so how does that change what I post on Facebook? Then I can't even begin to say I'm a Christian. How does that change how I discipline my toddler when he throws a car at his brother's head?
That's that mentality of all of Christ for all of life, right?
Yeah, that sounds familiar. I like that. And so I had a really good conversation on Instagram recently with a guy I used to work with, and we talked a little bit like that about some of that stuff. And he's not a believer, and I told him, he said something to me along the lines of, "You're the Christian that I talk to the most, with the most comprehensive way to view the world," or something along those lines. And I told him, I said, when Jesus says, when he gives the Great Commission and he tells the disciples that all authority under heaven and earth has been given to him, he means all authority. And so if Jesus is my king, right? Since Jesus is my king, since he's my Lord, and all authority has been given to him, that means he has authority over the way that I raise my kids. He has authority over the way that I operate on Twitter. He has authority over everything. And so I want to bring that to bear on every sort of area. It's not this segregated thing that happens on Sundays, and it's interesting because you would hear a lot in churches, at least. So I came to faith in high school, and but all of my church life I've heard, "Oh, your faith isn't just this thing that happens on Sundays. It's this thing that happens the rest of the week." What does that mean? Like practically, like you tell me that my faith is something that I live out the rest of my week. Well, my 3-year-old has just kicked my 8-month-old. What do I do? Right? Like it's like a fear, I think, of telling people what to do, of like giving you actions that you should actually take in light of your faith. Even though the New Testament is replete with that. I mean, Paul gives women like fashion advice, like don't dress this certain way because that's not how you don't want to look like the world, right? Like in light of the faith, don't wear these clothes, instead do this. And so what does that look like? Well, this anemia that we're talking about doesn't allow for it. It's this, I show up on Sunday morning and it's hellfire and brimstone, and the absolute most practicality that I'm going to get out of that 30-minute yelling match is to not vote for any Democrats, right? That's the end of it. You can't vote for Democrats. But then what do I do with what do I do with my kids? And so I told him, it's my faith is the reason that we'll homeschool. My faith is the reason that I believe in the right to own and to bear arms, even though I lost them all.
That's not a very balanced
It's not,
way of looking
it's
at it, right?
not very balanced, and I think that balance is really cowardice in disguise.
Yeah.
You're afraid to you don't want to draw any lines in the sand, right? Like, heaven forbid that you have the fortitude to say, I take the Bible seriously and I believe every word of it. Therefore, I'm going to go buy a shotgun, and I'm going to use. And if I have to use that shotgun, I'm willing to use that shotgun, right? Like, heaven. And you can, I mean, you can work your way there. That's obviously not a direct connection, but you work your way to that point. And I would get in arguments with people at work all the time, at the job before where I'm at now, and we would talk about politics, and we would talk about things like firearms. We would talk about things like gay marriage. We would talk about things like abortion, and it would get to the point that I have to say, you don't disagree with me politically. That's not the issue. You disagree with me because of what my faith teaches me. So my faith teaches me that God is the author of life. And so if there's a life in the womb of a woman, you don't get the right to destroy that. God's not giving you that right. And if you can't start there with me, we're not going to get this ball down the field at all. We're not going to make any progress in conversation unless we come back to that.
Those skills are weighted, right? They're not. There's no balance there,
right? There's not. You can't balance the. If you try to balance and find a middle ground between what the Bible teaches about life and the sanctity of life, and you try to find a middle ground between that and Roe, you're going to end up with 50 years of babies being slaughtered in the womb because the pro-life movement is too afraid to call it murder.
They found balance.
Right. They found the balance, and the balance is 50 years of
that was
millions,
the result.
That's the result is millions of dead babies. And that's a fruit of this anemia, this void, this vacuum that was really the whole reason that we wanted to start Roundtable to begin with, is because I want Christians in Appalachians, and I think this is really compounded, because if you are a cisgendered white evangelical conservative male, you already the deck is already stacked against you in terms of stereotypes in a lot of ways. And then throw in that you're from the state of West Virginia, right? You're just not going to be taken seriously publicly. At the end of the day, you're just not going to be taken seriously publicly because there are so many different stereotypes that are stacked against you. And so there's almost a fear of I want to seem as intelligent as the college kids, right? Or I want to seem as intelligent. And my thinking has been, people already have a perspective of you. Like, if you're in West Virginia, there are people in the world that think that you're stupid by virtue of where you were born and where you live. That's just the nature of it. Is people, well, lean into it, own it. They already think that you're stupid, right? Like, they already think you're uneducated. You're not going to do anything that you could to convince them otherwise. Paul has already told us that your message is foolishness to those who are perishing. And Paul has also told us that if Christ is not raised from the dead, we should be pitied more than anybody else on the planet. Okay? Just lean into that and own it. And so when someone, I'm trying to think if I should name drop or not. I'm not going to. There's a pastor who had some of his congregates were protesting. This may have been in Burgerville. They were maybe protesting gay marriage. And a more progressive pastor had showed up to debate with these congregants, so they called him, and he came down to debate pastor to pastor amongst all these protesters and counter protesters. Sounds like a wild scene. And the more progressive pastor said, "Well, don't you know that the Bible gives room for slavery?" And he said, "Sure. You just own it." And so the Bible says that babies are alive in their mother's womb, and if you take that life, you're murdering that child. You just own it, and you just take it. And the Bible has said that marriage is a man and a woman. You just own it, and you just say it. But I think we're afraid to, in Appalachia at least, we're afraid to do that because we're already perceived as ignorant, and we don't want to offer any sort of confirmation bias, and for someone in the world to say, well, obviously you think that. You're from Welch. Obviously you have this ignorant way of viewing the world because you're from Boone County and you don't know any better. And then with that comes the elitism of, let me show you the let me show you a more excellent way than believing what you believe.
But that's from really missing the point that the gospel is abrasive. It's a bombshell.
100%.
And we're trying to make it not abrasive.
Right.
We're trying to polish it, slip that medicine into their food and have them gobble it down, and then by then it's too late. But that's not the way the gospel works. It implodes from the inside out. And when we try to find balance, like you said, in between really two ends of the spectrum, you're really choosing your result there. Mm-hmm. You're not finding a middle way. You've chosen one side or the other when you pick a balanced position.
Well, you end up, I think with balance sounds like a good thing, and I think it is, but really what's being described is not so much a balance, but more so like a compromising and a lack of clarity that's even given. If you are to not make it as fine of a point as you can, which is clarifying it, it's when you make better comparisons, you can really clearly understand what somebody means and where they stand. But what sounds like is being used for balance is really just kind of coddling or trying to make it easier, more palatable, and kind of maybe hiding some of the rough edges so that people are less apt to have a negative response. But in the end, you could do that for 5 years with somebody, and then when they actually dug down deep on the issue, maybe they still think the same thing. Then they're just as reactive as they would have been. Mm-hmm. There's not really any favor being done with that. It's just putting off or being, hearing y'all talk about this makes me think also of like attractionalness in a church or church service. It's not maybe that we should make it palatable for people that disagree, but it's a better, more Christ-like response to be very clear and forthright. Mm-hmm. And it's harder to have good explanations for that maybe, but the most loving thing would be to be honest, as difficult as that may be at times, and just own it, just kind of go with it. And they may be actually more thankful you did that. Who knows? You can't judge people's response and try to play a game like that, like a chess game in a conversation. Like, well, this won't make him too mad, so I can go this far with it, and then maybe next time I can push it further.
Just inch the line.
Yeah. You just have to be, cordial, or you don't want your speech. Like if you're yelling at them, it's a distraction maybe from it. It's not necessary. But you would rather the truth or something be the thing that's actually divided over, nothing about you.
So you're saying it's almost like that meme format with Scooby-Doo, right? And they say there's someone there who has the face that says balanced theology. They say let's remove the mask and see what's really underneath, and it's compromise.
Mm-hmm. That sounds to be what's being described. Yeah. Now that people could apply that in different ways. Balance isn't inherently bad. Balance, you may say, is, some people would use it in this way to say it's presenting the truth, but also doing it in love.
Right.
That's fine, but
or like law and grace, right?
Yeah, right.
A mixture of both. Two hands there, not one.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think if you start with the idea of I want to be the one who's balanced,
or that everything can be balanced,
right? But if you start with I want to be that guy, like I want to be the guy that finds the middle ground, you've already turned yourself over to the person that you disagree with, right? So, if Josiah takes position A, then I take position not A, and I want to find a balance between, and I am the one that actively wants to find the balance between our two positions. I've already given myself over to him, and I'm going to do what I can to strike that balance.
You conceded half the battle
from the jump. But you are stuck on A, and so the more that I concede and the more that I give over, I'm coming closer and closer and closer to your
more and
position.
more A.
Yeah, and it's either compromise, which is just another way that I think that cowardice manifests itself, or you secretly already agreed with that position in some way. So if you think of like one argument that really just that riles me up when you think about the issue of abortion, right? And people will always say like, well, under Democratic presidents, the rate of abortion falls. So therefore we should vote in officials who are going to make it easier to kill our children, right? If you want to find the balance between that position and the position that says abortion is murder, that means either you're a coward and you're afraid to say abortion is murder and it should not be happening, it should not be legislated, or you don't actually think that it's that big of a deal because there's that disconnect from your faith and what you believe, what you say you believe about things like sin and the soul and heaven and what happens on a Saturday morning when you wake up after a week of work. There's that. That's all. It all comes back to that. Is how are you going to connect your faith? How does your faith connect to? And primarily at this point we've been talking about politics, but that stretches everywhere, right? Like that stretches into education, right? There are people who believe that home education shouldn't even be an option, that everybody should be given the same standard government education. And there are people who believe that government education should be abolished at the very least, at the federal level, and public schools should be community schools again, right? You can't balance those. You're starting from two, like one of those positions is closer to the right answer than the other. Or if you think of, what would be another example other than politics or education? What's another position that comes to your mind that you can't reconcile? There's no balance between them.
Science.
Flesh that out.
So when it comes to things like naturalism, I can't find a balance between there is a God and there is not a God, right? I cannot say that we are protoplasm with energy acted on it and chance, and here we are. And I cannot say that and find a balance between, and God created us.
There's not a half God.
Right. There's not something in between. And that mentality of how you approach science is going to leak into other areas like abortion. Well, if it's true for protoplasm and energy, then what does it look like for a fetus, right? You cannot abort the gospel from any realm of your life. It's impossible. And, up until now, we've been talking about more of the negative side of what it looks like in Appalachia, especially in the church. But there's a lot of positives that go unnoticed, too. Some of the ones that come to mind for me that really we hit home runs on in Appalachia Christianity are things like Christian brotherhood, sacrificial giving, all these areas of love and sacrifice that we see from people who really are destitute in a lot of areas. And it seems to be, and this is one of the parables, or well, actually not a parable, this is something that Jesus saw with the widow with the two mites, right? It's those who have the least who seem to be willing to give the most. And I think, in my experience, a lot of Christians who have given of their time and efforts, finances, everything like that to me and my family were those who were not rich, those who did not have influence, those who did not have the time to do so, but they're more than willing to do that. And that's really void in a lot of areas too. I mean, I think of family members I have outside West Virginia and their experiences in big cities like DC or Houston or anything. The individualism there is rampant. There's no family in the church. You go to your service, you do what you think you need to do, and then you leave. Beyond that, the church, the four walls end right there. And one of the things that we've excelled at, in my opinion, I'm sure you all can think of even more than those, are sacrificial giving, Christian brotherhood. Those are things that really we can work on and use those strengths to empower the church more.
And I think there's also, despite lack of education in terms of theology and doctrine, despite lack of knowing, I think there's a real commitment to being faithful. I want to word this accurately. Being faithful to what the Bible teaches, insofar as people understand it. Okay, so I might be a little bit off in my interpretation about what the Bible teaches. Let's say, let's say welfare, for example. Okay, And my position currently, not hypothetically, my position currently is that the state shouldn't, that's not the state's job. That's not a thing. That the government should not have any sense of social safety net. That should be the church and family. Okay, that's my Twitter version of what I take. And I might be off in that, but I'm committed to that because I believe that's what the Bible teaches. Okay, so what that looks, another example would be like in Appalachia. There's a commitment to defining marriage traditionally because it's what the Bible teaches, right? There's a reason that it's a large evangelical voting bloc in this area, because I think the Bible teaches X. I believe X. And they might be, does that make sense? Like, they might be really wrong about what X teaches. But you've got to run to the Bible, and you've got to show me from the scriptures that this is what is taught. Before you change the way that I vote, whether it's red or blue, or before you change the way that I buy a gun or turn it over for a buyback, you better run to the scriptures, and you better show me from there. And I think that that's really advantageous. We're not in a position where you might be somewhere like the Pacific Northwest, where there's a skepticism of the Bible and if it's valid or not. There's just an acceptance, at least amongst Christians, that the Bible is God's word. That's it. You don't need to show me I'm not going to argue with you about textual variants. I'm not going to argue with you about the validity. I'm not going to get into like the argument about which texts that we use, right? Like, the Bible that I have in my lap is from God. And if it teaches me X, then I'm going to believe X, and I'm going to live my life with X. And so I think that puts Appalachia in a really unique position, because if you have a resource, or if you have a teacher who can articulate things well, and can be really patient, because if you're coming to this region to plant, or if you're coming to this region to teach or to instruct, like I said earlier, you're going to be here for generations if you really want to see the fruit of anything. So if you have any sort of patience or articulation, and you can show somebody how the Bible teaches this position, people buy it wholesale.
And they don't
be fully
care.
committed to it.
They don't care what Luther or Calvin or Melanchthon think.
We don't even know who those people are.
Right. They're going to ask, what does the text say?
Yeah.
You know?
Well, Daddy taught me that Romans 4:18 says this. I don't even know what that verse says. Just pull that out of there. But Daddy taught me that Romans 4:18 means I should never vote for a Republican. What do you say?
Yeah.
Right. And you say,
You have to grapple with the text.
Right.
I think another, when Josiah was talking about strengths of the culture, one of the biggest things that comes to my mind compared to or contrasted against other parts of the country is the contentment, at least for those that stay. I think there are those that have bought into a different view of the world that will move out and try to go to a bigger city that has, quote unquote, more to offer. Mm-hmm. But there's definitely a contentment for a lot of people that stay, that they're totally fine. Other people do not understand this because they're so bought into materialism, and how much you own or all these things make you happy because you can drive the movie theater and it's 5 minutes away. And the people from where I'm from drove 45 minutes really to go to the grocery store every week, or anything big in town. Like, that could have been it unless it was a little country store or something. Those people are not interested, by and large, on the big city ideas, if you will. They're very content with the little bit that they have, and they're not bought into materialism. And that probably plays into, like Josiah said, people being more apt to give or willing to show support or to help out other people. There's a positive stereotype of people being more friendly in those areas, or they'll talk to you when they see you out, as opposed to other places where people are not nice. Yeah. I have a hard time going even to bigger areas, even of our state, potentially, especially any big city in another state. Yeah, I feel like people are so rude because my norm is very different than that norm. So I think the contentment that we see is another thing that really is pretty amazing and admirable. You go down the coal fields and see what people live with, and they're happy with it. Mm-hmm. That's a good thing.
And you can point out an outsider when as soon as you see them, when they start complaining and whining, you're like, man,
you don't know.
You are not from here, right?
Yeah.
But people have roots. Like they have roots in these communities where I've lived here. My family's been here their whole life. My family has been here for 20 years in this community, and that's the house that my grandparents lived in, and they had 20 acres, and a mile down the road, that's the house that my parents lived in, and I'm a mile down the road from them and building my own house, and that's that people have this. There's a rooted and there's a community. I mean, that's more rural. It doesn't happen so much like here in Charleston, right? But even in Charleston, there is a sense of I grew up in Canal City and went to Charleston Catholic, and because that's where my mom wanted me to go, because that's where she graduated high school. And even though we weren't Catholic, that's the school that she went to, and that's the school that she wanted me to go to, because that's where her mom went, and her mom went, and her and so there is a sense of this is where I belong. I'm from this region. We're a lot of homebodies, which kind of plays into like the ignoramus stereotype, I think. But I also see the other side of that is people who stay, some people who stay who are discontented and say, why can't this area be more like this bigger city that has all of this? Like, what can I do? What could we be doing to make Charleston more like Columbus, right? And there's no sense of, why can't Charleston just be Charleston? Why can't Canal City just be Canal City? Why can't these towns just be what they are? Why do I have to be the next? Why do we need to be another Louisville? Why do we need to be another whatever? Just be what you are. Just be Charleston, be Welch, be Dunbar, be whatever it is, and don't be worried about, because there's that. I just feel like I'm beating this dead horse, but there's this. You either could not care less what people think about you in terms of elites who look down at you, or you believe the lies that they are selling you, and you want to be on the center stage like all these other big cities are. That was just something that I thought of when you're talking about people that are content.
That's where this podcast, hopefully, among other things that we have in our sleeves right now that we're not going to release just yet, but that's one of the things that this podcast can fill a void, is because we recognize the strengths, we recognize the weaknesses, and when we talk about different topics like we will next week, we are not going to address topics that are of no concern to West Virginia. No West Virginian is thinking about whether or not there's life on Mars and whether or not they have souls or whatever else it was.
To baptize robots.
Yeah, do we baptize robots? They don't care, right?
Nobody in West Virginia. I'll name drop. Russ Moore wrote that stupid article about, should we baptize your robot aunt or whatever it was. And I posted it and said, this is the dumbest thing. And two people jumped on and like, well, we need to think about it. And I'll put down next week's paycheck that thought had not crossed anybody's mind until they read that headline.
Yep. And it hasn't since.
And then since then, they've not, unless they're listening right now. They're like,
this is the second time.
They're like, oh yeah, should we baptize robots?
Yeah.
Oh,
and no, we're not going. I won't say we won't, but we're probably never going to.
So next week when we have Russ Moore on,
right, we're going to talk about baptizing robots.
We're going to bring Russ Moore, and I'm going to bring my Roomba
to baptize
it.
Should we sprinkle?
You got to use oil if it's a robot, I guess.
Just avoid the warranty.
If we sprinkle oil, or do we dunk it in oil? Both.
That's a question for next week.
Yeah, that's after that. All right, guys. Thanks for talking to us.
See you.
Thanks for listening.
At next week's.
Anthony, are you worried that people are going to ask you, who went to Charleston Catholic, are going to be like, what year did you graduate? Because you're
Oh, I didn't go to Charleston Catholic. No. But yeah.
Yeah, in your example, you're like, oh, yeah. Oh, because if my mom went there, and then I went there.
Yeah. No, the other Charleston Catholic.
Yeah, right.